smiður, hver skáldið biður, komi mjúk til mín, miskunnin þín.
This is the saga of Disa, a young woman who everybody agreed did the wrong thing. Disa was from Surnadal. It's in western Norway. It's a fjord and a valley, and it's not far from Bergen. Surnadal is a wide valley with high mountains and forests, and a river that runs through the valley to the sea, and a beach of white pebbles. Disa grew up with 2 brothers, and their names were Kells and Geese Li. Disa was the oldest of the 3. Kells was the middle brother and a little bit flaky. But Geese Li was strong. He was a builder. He was good with words, and he was a leader, and he was a fighter. Disa had to look after her younger brothers, and she would take them swimming at the beach at Surnadal, and she would watch her feet in the water on the white pebbles, and she would think of all the things that could befall them. Because this was the Viking world, where young men died. The valley of Surnadal was soaked in blood. At night, she would picture situations where their lives would be threatened. She'd see them fighting or working or sailing in open ships, and each time, Disa imagined herself saving their lives. She would step in and protect them, because she loved nothing more than her brothers, Kells and Geese Li. Disa grew up to be a fine woman. She was curious about the world, sensual. She touched things. She was intelligent. And her father recognized these things in her, and he wanted to give her a gift. So they went together to Bergen, to the town and to the market, and they entered a marketplace, and eventually they found themselves at a carpentry workshop. And Disa's father said to her, "You can choose anything in here that you want." And Disa's eyes fell on a large chest with a carved lid. And she looked at the carving and she touched it. There was a man, there was a woman, 2 other men, children. It was a beautiful carving. The workmanship was excellent. But there was something about it that troubled her. There was a flame running through the whole thing. She asked the carpenter, "Why did you put a flame in such a wonderful work?" And he looked at Disa's father and said, "Have you not told her the story of Gudrun and Attila?" When they were riding home with the new chest, Disa's father told her that story. The most beautiful woman was called Gudrun. And she had 2 brothers, just like Disa did, and their names were Gunnar, a great king, and Hugni, a man with a valiant heart. And of course, Gudrun was the match of the world, and eventually she was betrothed to King Attila, who lived on the River Rhine, and she moved to Attila's castle. But Attila heard about something else. Apparently, there was gold to be had where Gudrun had lived. Gunnar and Högni were hiding it. And so all of a sudden, Attila wanted the gold more than he wanted Gudrun. He sent word to the brothers Gunnar and Högni to come to a feast. If they came, they would be showered with gifts, horses, spears, fighting dogs. Gudrun sent another message. Don't come. It's a trap. But the brothers weren't in the habit of acting out of fear, and they traveled to the court. And as soon as they got there, they were taken prisoner and put in different cells. And then Attila came into Gunnar's cell with something in his hand. It was a beating human heart. And he said to Gunnar, "This is your brother's heart." It quivered in his hands. Gunnar said, "That is not my brother's heart. It wouldn't quiver like that. Show me Högni's heart." So Attila went back to Högni's cell, and when he returned, this time it was with a heart that beat hard and true, a valiant heart. And Gunnar said, "Yes, now I believe you. You have killed my brother Högni. And now I'm the only man who knows where the gold is hidden. You will never get it from me." Attila was furious, and he took Gunnar and threw him into a pit that was filled with snakes. Gunnar stood up in the pit, and the snakes began to wrap themselves around his legs, and he began to sing. Gudrun was listening to the voice of her brother singing as he died. She made a vow. She would take revenge for the deaths of her brothers. Attila held the feast, and during the night, Gudrun went up to her husband and said, "How do you enjoy your meal?" "Very well," said Attila. "In that case, let me tell you that you are eating the flesh of our children. You will never see them ride again. You will never see them play." Attila was horrified. He ran off and he lay down in his bed, grief-stricken. And then Gudrun took a knife to his chest. And then she set fire to the whole place and destroyed everything they had ever owned together. Disa's father said, "Gudrun was a good woman. She did the right thing." That was the lesson. You must always put your brothers first. What a lesson for a young girl to hear. I first encountered Disa when I was 18 years old, here actually in Brisbane, in my first ever class at university, believe it or not. I sat down and my tutor began to take the roll, and eventually he looked up and said, "Kári, are you from Iceland?" I said, "Yes." "Oh, in that case, you really must do our old Icelandic course in the Icelandic Sagas. You could still study the Icelandic Sagas at university." And so, of course, I enrolled straight away in a course in the Icelandic Sagas. Now, I was born in Iceland, but I left as a child, and so even though I knew about the sagas, I'd never had the chance to read one. I'd never known what they were really about. And now, in Brisbane, of all places, I discovered what a saga was. So what is a saga? A saga is a telling. Saga is from the Icelandic word segja. It means to say something. And a saga is a telling. It tells a story that we all share. To begin with, they were oral stories, stories brought over from Norway and Sweden, Finland and Denmark, the Norse world. And they were stories about the first people who came to Iceland, that faraway island in the North Atlantic. They told stories about settlement, about family, about honor, about violence, and about what it meant to be in a family. That family was always the first thing, the ultimate obligation, the thing that you could not negotiate your way from. Family honor was everything. That is a manuscript, a vellum manuscript. And we know that the Icelanders cared about their stories because they put them down onto calfskin vellum. Now, one of those manuscripts took about 50 calves to make, 50 lives to collect stories. And the first people that wrote down the Icelandic sagas did them on these vellum manuscripts, and then they passed them around the community and shared these stories. That's how important they became in Iceland, a country that wasn't really all that wealthy. In the 1500s and the 1600s, Iceland actually became desperately, desperately poor and almost stopped existing as a country. The population was reduced to 30,000 people. It was no place to keep these manuscripts. And so they were sent abroad. They were sent to Denmark, and they were housed in the Royal Library in Copenhagen. The Danes were the colonial power in Iceland. And in 1944, when Iceland regained their independence, the first thing they did was ask the Danes, can we have the sagas back? And they say in Iceland that hundreds of years of colonial rule were forgiven on one day. This day, April 1973, when the Danes, bless them, sent a frigate with just one piece of cargo, a single manuscript called Flatey Book, the Book of Flatey Island, with sagas in it. And the whole of the country came down to see it arrive. The sagas were home. And Iceland could become Iceland again. They took me home as well. I began reading the sagas voraciously, obsessively, and I fell in love with the characters in the world of the sagas. People like Disa. She was in a saga called the Saga of Geese Li, named after her brother, Geese Li. And I took all the courses. And then I did an honours year in the Icelandic Sagas. And then I did a master's in the Icelandic Sagas. Yeah. And then I started a PhD, and I decided to do it in the Icelandic Sagas, as you do. I was on my way home, right? It was now 10 years since I'd been home. And so I decided that it was about time I actually bought a ticket and went back to my birthplace. I went to the STA Travel at St. Lucia at the University of Queensland, okay? And I took my place on a bench where you had to wait before you got served. There was a counter of travel agents. You watched them and you waited for your turn. But I did notice one in particular. She was kind of walking up and down officiously. She was rather pretty. I remember what she was wearing. It was a grey skirt, a grey top, and she was wearing like a jumper with a purple band across the arm. And I have to admit, I was kind of hoping I would be served by her. And I was really lucky. I sat down in front of her and I said, I'd like to buy a ticket to Reykjavik. She said, oh, I've never sold a ticket to Reykjavik before. I said, well, there you have it. A few months later, I had to go back to change the date of my ticket. And I sat down in front of her. Her name was Olander. And I said, I have to change the date. I said, but I can see something's happened. Your arm is in a sling. What's happened? She said, I broke my collarbone skiing. I said, oh, that must be terrible. Must be very hard. You probably don't have anything to do with your life, when you've got a broken collarbone. She said, yes, I am rather confined. I said, what do you do in the evenings, for example? Are you able to go to movies? Is that something you could do? And she said, yes, I could go to a movie. So we went to a film. Well, I had to book tickets first, right? So there is a cinema at UQ, and so I booked tickets to a film, and I thought this was a good idea because it was a French film. Now, I didn't exactly understand the meaning of the title. I just thought it was French, it's fancy, it's going to be good. Unfortunately, it soon emerged that it was very thinly disguised pornography. And I was sitting next to Olander watching young people discover their bodies. Still, that's all right, it's French, that's okay. So we got out of the cinema and Olander said, what are you doing now? I said, even though I was 27, I didn't actually have a driver's license yet. So I said, do you mind taking me home? She said, all right. Where do I take you? She said, well, I'm actually in between places at the moment. Would you mind taking me to my mother's? Now, despite all of those things, we managed a second date, but not serious, right? No way. I was about to leave for Iceland. It couldn't possibly be a serious thing. No promises. But when I got to the airport to board my flight, I rang her and I told her that I loved her. And then when I got to Iceland, I collected all the gold coins I could. And I put them in the payphone. And I asked her to join me in Iceland. And she did, despite the French porno. Now, Iceland in 2001, what are you thinking? Cool, hip, trendy? That's Iceland now. Iceland in 2001 was still kind of rather attached to the old Iceland, which I think of as mainly miserable. Okay, so this is the Iceland of dour faces and harshness and silence and cold and wind. There's a joke in Iceland, if it's either windy or wet or cold, and if it isn't one of those things, it's a beautiful day. This is a hard place to live, a place you really have to love to want to live there. And it's a place where it doesn't always pay to be a newcomer, right? It's very hard to work your way into the community. And here was this bright Australian girl in Iceland, and she couldn't quite understand. She kept asking me, why doesn't anybody smile in Iceland? And it's true, no one did. A few years ago, Iceland actually began a You Can Smile Now campaign. And it was a series of ads, actually, showing everyday situations, the shopping, where someone would buy something, and then at the end of the transaction, they would smile. And the caption was, it's okay to smile now. So Icelanders have only been smiling for about 10 years. And here was this sort of fresh person from here, such an open place compared to Iceland, really. And she was shocked. And so it didn't really work out, to be honest. We left Iceland under a little bit of a cloud, and I thought it would probably be a very long time before we returned. Disa grew up to be a lovely young woman. She still cared for her brothers, Geese Li and Kells, but she began to find her own life as well. And eventually, she fell in love. She fell in love with a young boy who lived in the farm up the valley from theirs. But he wasn't quite right. He was poorer than they were, less noble, not really suitable. Kells, the middle brother, he didn't mind because he was friends with Bath, with Disa's new love. But Geese Li was not happy. Geese Li didn't like the idea of Disa seeing someone who was below them in standing, and he hated the idea that it was all starting to happen behind his back. Disa should have asked for the family's permission, but she knew it wouldn't have been given. And she kept on seeing Barth. They would meet in the clearing near the woods, a little way up the hill behind the farm. And eventually Geese Li had to say something about it. He told her to stop seeing Barth, but she kept seeing him. And then he had a word to Barth himself. He said, "You must stop seeing my sister. I am warning you about this." And Barth turned to Geese Li and said, "I will see who I want to. I do not need your advice." One day, Barth and Kell were going to go for a ride. And Geese Li said that he would like to join them, but he took with him a spear and he put it into his saddlebag. As they were riding out from the farm, they followed a track that winds its way to the river, the Surnadal River. And as you get closer to the river, the track begins to narrow as you come towards a bridge, and there's only room for 2 horses at a time. Geese Li pushed his way next to Barth so that Kell was pushed back behind them, and now it was Geese Li and Barth riding side by side towards the bridge with Kell behind them. And that was the moment when Geese Li drew the spear and held it over Barth's back and then dragged it down from his shoulder through to his waist and cut the boy open in half so that the top of his torso began to lean forward, and he fell off the horse dead. Kell jumped down to be with his friend. Geese Li said, "There's no need. There's no need to look. He's dead." Barth was dead, but Kell wanted to stay anyway. Geese Li took the spear. It was still covered in Barth's blood. And he held it down to his brother and said, "You should take my weapon. Yours doesn't seem to cut very well anymore." They had made an enemy. Barth's family had no choice but to attack. But they didn't do it straight away. They waited. They made the family wait. And at night, Disa would lie in bed, listening to the timber beams groan, grief-stricken, wishing for her own death. But something strange happened, because when the flames came and the fire began to burn the outside of the building, when she heard their attackers' dogs barking outside and the screams, she wanted life. She wanted to live and she wanted to escape. She felt Geese Li's hand on her wrist, pulling her somewhere. She was going downstairs towards the kitchen where they kept vats of whey, cold whey. Geese Li told them all to get into the whey. And the flames burnt around them, and eventually the outer walls began to break, and they saw a way out. They pushed through. And they made their way through the fields and then up into the hills. And when they stopped hearing the dogs barking, they knew they were safe. They'd escaped. But they couldn't stay in Norway anymore. They got all of their things and put them in an open ship, and they began to sail for Iceland. They made their escape across the North Atlantic and up into that faraway island and into its very furthest western reaches called the Westfjords, the fjordlands of that far headland to the left. And eventually they got land at a place called Haukedal. It means the Valley of the Hawks. After our first attempt at living in Iceland, Icelander and I returned to Brisbane and I went back to my PhD in the Icelandic Sagas. After a couple of years I finished it, and then Icelander and I got married. We got married on the rocks at Noosa, which felt about as far away from Iceland as you can be. But it wasn't quite done with yet. Not long after we got married, there was a phone call in the middle of the night. It was from a principal in a college in the Westfjords, just around the corner from Haukedal, Hawk Valley, asking me if I would be interested in taking a job as a teacher at the college. Icelander and I sat up all night talking. Could we do it? Could we try again? And eventually we decided, yes. How could you not? How could you not go to Haukedal, where Disa had lived 1,000 years ago? And so we prepared for a second trip. And we flew to Reykjavik. And when we got to Reykjavik, we looked up friends and families, and they all had exactly the same reaction. How on earth can you take that poor girl to the Westfjords? Even in Iceland, they thought of it as the end of the world. It's so cold. It's so wet. It's so miserable. People have never smiled in Ísafjörður. And worst of all, right, the darkness. In Ísafjörður and the Westfjords, the sun sets behind the mountains in November, and it comes up again in February. No direct light between those months. It was a kind of madness to be going there, but we couldn't resist it. And we got our things together, and we flew to the Westfjords. Disa arrived in Haukedal, and the family began a second life. They needed to start again. They'd lost everything in Norway, but they had some land. They'd been able to buy this land in the valley of Haukedal. And Geese Li, remember, was a wonderful builder, an expert craftsman, and he put himself to work straight away, and he built them a beautiful farmhouse. And they began again. They began to meet people in the district, and the district accepted them as Norwegian exiles. They even were able to marry. Kell, the vain, flighty one, married a vain, chatty, flighty girl called Ásgeir. Geese Li, stoic, he married a steady, good woman called Auð. And he became very good friends with Auð's brother, a man called Stein. But Disa made the best match. She married a chieftain, one of the powerful men of Iceland, a man called Grim. And he was from the south. And even though he was from the south, and even though he was rich, for some reason he decided to move to Haukedal and to live with the family there. And so suddenly, instead of 3 siblings living at the farm, there were 3 couples living at the farm. 6 people. And it was crowded, too crowded. And so Geese Li built a second farm on the other side of the valley. And Disa and her husband Grim went to live there. And even though they had their own farm, it was still very tight. They could all see each other all of the time and hear what they were doing. Geese Li made a friend called Stein, and the two of them made a blood pact. They would always stand up for each other. And Geese Li's friendship seemed even more powerful than his relationship with his brother, Kell. Kell didn't like Iceland. He didn't like this isolation. He didn't like the fjord, and he missed Norway. He would spend all day lying beside the fire. He refused to help out with the farm work. One day he was lying beside the fire, and he heard some voices at the other end of the house, women's voices, talking. He thought he'd go and listen in to what they were saying. So he walked up to the room where they were, and he stood outside listening. They were just chatting. It was his wife, Ásgerð, and Geese Li's wife, Auð. They were doing some work. They were cutting out shirts for the men. But then Ásgerð said something. She said, Auð, would you mind cutting this shirt out for me, for Kell? And Auð said, you wouldn't have asked me to do it. If it was for my brother, Stein, you would have wanted to cut that shirt out yourself. What had they said? Nothing much. Just that once Ásgerð, Kells wife, had fancied Stein, Auð's brother. But when Kell heard this, he felt differently about it. And he walked into the room and he said, there's blood in those words. That night, when Kell was in his bedroom, Ásgerð came in, his wife, and Kell said, you're not welcome in my bed. I don't want you to lie with me any longer. Ásgerð put her arms around Kell, and she told him, you either take me into your bed now and show me that things are still the same between us, or I am leaving you tonight and I'm taking everything I own with me. Kell said, you better get into bed then. But that wasn't the end of the matter. He was so jealous, and his jealousy formed into bitterness towards Stein, towards this man that Ásgerð had once loved. And then Kell decided he couldn't live with Geese Li anymore either, with Stein's friend. And so Kell moved, and he went to live with Disa and Grim. And so now there were 4 at that farm, and Geese Li and Auð were left alone at theirs. Geese Li decided it was time for the family to hold a feast, an autumn feast, a tradition. And he invited everyone from the district, but he did send a message to Stein to stay away. It wasn't safe for him in Haukadal. He wasn't going to do that. He wasn't afraid. And so he rode into Haukadal on the night of the feast. And he put bells on his saddle so that everybody could hear that he was here. On the night of the feast, a storm came through Haukadal, and all of the men had to go outside to cover the hay. Stein obviously offered to help, but Geese Li said, no, I want you to stay inside. It's not safe. The weather was coming into the house, and rain began to drip down the inside of the wall. So Stein moved his bed into the middle of the hall, and he began to fall asleep. And then he heard footsteps. He stood up, he put his hand out, and he felt a man's body, and then he felt the spear as it went into his chest. And he said, cut. cut. Kell had killed Stein. Geese Li held a burial for his friend. In those days, it was a custom to wear shoes into the afterlife. They were called hell shoes. Geese Li put the hell shoes on his friend's feet. And then Grim did something strange. He stood up and he walked over to the body and he said, "Let me fix the shoes." He retied the laces so hard that the flesh began to squelch. And he said, "I don't know how to tie shoes if they come off." He wanted Geese Li to know that he approved of the killing. Disa fell pregnant. And the old women in the farm told her that one day she would have a boy. And even though Stein was dead and there was tension in the valley, the pregnancy gave her some optimism. She felt that things might improve between the two houses. Grim even decided to hold a feast of his own. And he too invited people from all around the district to attend. But then he did something that I think he shouldn't have done. When Stein had visited the year before, he'd brought some tapestries as a gift to Geese Li. Grim thought it would be a good idea to ask for a loan of those tapestries. He said he wanted Stein's tapestries on his walls. Grim and Kell had become inseparable. Geese Li was furious, but he couldn't attack his brother, and that left only one man. He must go for Grim if he was to avenge his friend. On the night of the feast, Geese Li crept out of his house and along a creek that runs between the two farms. He went in through the back and up into Disa and Grim's room. And then he put his hand under the covers to find out where Grim was lying, and he touched Disa's breast. She woke up. "Why is your hand so cold, Kell?" she said. Grim woke up and said, "Do you want me to roll over?" And they made love. Disa and Grim made love while Geese Li stood in the shadows in her room. And then, when they fell apart, Geese Li walked up to the bed and put a spear into Grim so hard that it passed through his body and into the timber beams of the bed they were lying on. He'd done it again. He'd killed a second one of Disa's loves. She had lost both the men she loved to her brother. I told you they were violent. Icelander and I flew to the Westfjords, and we began our life in this little village called Westfjords. I began teaching. In Iceland, people are always quite interested when Icelanders return. There's a bit of a fuss made over the returning Icelander. And before long, everyone was wondering, who was this Australian Icelander who was finally back in Iceland? What had kept him away all these years? And eventually, the newspapers caught hold of the story, And they wanted to know, who was this Australian Icelander who was back in Iceland after all of this time? The title of that headline story is "Lawyer with a doctor's degree in the Icelandic Sagas is back in Iceland." That was big news. And not long after that, the national newspapers got in touch with me and they asked for an interview as well about my return to Iceland. And then the TV channels, they wanted to know, was I really back in Iceland and why had I been away so long? I was back in Iceland. I could confirm it. And in a way, it was easy for me. It was easy to come back, to be welcomed as the sort of returning son. But what about the other character in that story? What about the other person who was the wife of the lawyer with a doctor's degree in the Icelandic Sagas? People weren't really asking about her. And it was a hard experience again, because here we were in the outer extremes of Iceland, and there wasn't really terribly much to do. We went for walks, all of the time, every day, and we went into the valleys, and there's no doubt about it, they are intensely, intensely beautiful. And as the seasons passed, we picked berries in the fjordlands, but you can't look at mountains all the time. Eventually, you have to do something else, right? So Icelander started looking for a job, but there just was no jobs. There was no work for people who didn't speak Icelandic. Well, there was one job. You could get a job gutting fish in the local fish factory. I have to say, I became a little bit controlling at this point, and I begged her, please don't work in the fish factory. I just couldn't bear the thought of Icelander coming home smelling of fish guts every evening. And had I really brought, my wife, a professional woman, all this way just for her to clean fish? But she wanted her own connection with Iceland, not mine, hers. And she wanted a job. We flew to Reykjavik for Christmas. And while we were there, another phone call. All right, but this time it was for Icelander. And it was from the manager of the Ísafjörður sushi factory. The Ísafjörður sushi factory was interested in employing Icelander as a sushi maker. And we talked about it. And given that sushi is a far superior product to just plain old fish, we agreed. Start working at the sushi factory. And she did. When we went back, Icelander took the job at the sushi factory, and it turned out to be the most amazing thing. She loved it. I worried about us living there, but she kept saying, look where we are. It's amazing. And the sushi factory turned out to be this little community of foreign women. Women from Thailand, from Poland, from Germany, and one woman from Australia. And they spent all morning laughing and singing and talking and telling stories. And she wasn't at all unhappy to be in Ísafjörður. In the mornings, I'd walk with Icelander along the foreshore of Ísafjörður. This is the valley where we lived. And it was incredible. It smelt of oil, trawler oil. It smelt of fish, it smelt of snow, it smelt of cold wind, and it smelt like we were in Iceland. Disa had lost her two loves to her brother Geese Li. She had no choice. She had to leave. And the only way of leaving was to marry somebody else. So she married her dead husband's brother. Not a good man. His name was Burk. But it was her only way of getting away from Geese Li. And so she married him. And she moved with Burk to the property in the south where Grim had come from. And she began a new life there. And then she did the thing that everybody agreed was wrong. She told her new husband who the killer was. She told him that it was Geese Li who killed Grim. And that meant that Burke, her new husband, had no choice but to chase down and kill Geese Li. But it wasn't going to be easy. Geese Li was an incredibly strong man, and he went into hiding. He went up into the heaths, and he became an exile. And in Iceland, Geese Li is famous for the fact that he survived for 13 years as an exile in the heathlands on the highlands. But eventually, they were able to get him. Not Burke. He didn't do it himself. He hired an assassin, a man called Eyjolf the Grey. And Eyjolf finally tracked down Geese Li, attacked him, and was able to take his life. When Eyjolf the Grey came back to the farm with the news of Geese Li's death, Disa's new husband, Burke, was elated. He said, finally, the disgrace on our family has been cleared. Disa, I want you to prepare a great meal for Eyjolf. And she came out with a very small bowl of cold porridge. And she put it in front of Eyjolf. Her husband, Burke, knocked the porridge off the table, and then Disa crouched down to pick it up, and she saw on the floor that Eyjolf the Grey had left his sword. She picked it up, and she stuck it into Eyjolf the Grey's leg. She took revenge for Geese Li's life, just as she had taken revenge for Grim's. Disa left Burke that night, and she started her own farm, and she brought up her son, a boy they called Snorri. Snorri means the difficult, tempestuous one. He wasn't brave, though. He was just difficult, argumentative. He didn't like a fight. He couldn't stand the sight of blood. And Disa once again found herself worrying about a man she loved and what this world would do to him. Snorri fell in love. He fell in love with a girl nearby called Ásdís. And he decided that if he was going to have any chance with Ásdís, he would have to build a finer home. So he began to build a better farmhouse for the family. One day, Snorri and Disa rode to the harbour to collect some timber. But then a cargo came off the ships that nobody liked. It was 2 Swedish berserks. A berserk was someone who lost all self-control during a fight, someone who was completely unbeatable. And they went to live at a farm owned by a man called Styr, who was Ásdís's father. Snorri was faced with the fact that 2 berserks were now living at the farm where his love lived. And it wasn't long before one of them fell in love with Ásdís. The girl's father, Styr, was completely distraught and distressed, and he went looking for advice from Snorri, who was known for his cunning plans. Snorri spoke to Disa, and they came up with this. Snorri told Styr to set the berserks a challenge. They must build a path through the lava field that runs between your farm and the next one. You've always wanted a path through there. Here's your chance. And if they can complete the path in 3 days, then one of them may marry Ásdís. But while they're building the path, I want you to build a bath for them, somewhere to soak their bones when the work is done, and put a roof over the bath made of heavy stones. Styr set the Berserks this challenge. And they went to work, and they fired up, and they lost all self-control, and in 3 days they did build a path through the lava field. And then Styr said, "Well done, lads. You deserve a bath." They walked over to the bath, they sat down in the warm spring water, and they fell asleep. And Styr walked up onto the roof and collapsed the stones onto their heads, and they drowned in their sleep. Snorri celebrated the success of the plan with Styr, and then he said, "I have one more idea. How would you feel about me marrying Ásdís instead?" And Styr agreed. And Disa got to see her son safe and happy and married. This is the Berserkers Path. You can visit it today. It's still there, a path that runs in the lava field between where Styr and Ásdís once lived, and not far from where Disa and Snorri settled after she stuck that blade into Eyjolf the Grey's leg. Snorri started a family, and he had children of his own. Icelander and I started our family in Iceland as well. We spent a year in the Westfjords, and then eventually we moved to Reykjavik to live. And that's where our first son, Finnur, was born. And when that happened, something changed forever for Icelander. She fell in love completely with Iceland. And she became part of a very elaborate genealogical database that exists there, that connects all Icelanders to every other Icelander who ever existed. And her name is there in the database, next to mine, but there. And our children's names are in there as well. When we had a child, Icelander wanted to be with her family, and we moved back to Australia. But I think I can say that she now misses Iceland even more than I do, which is quite an achievement. We go back often as a family. The last time I went was in September last year. And I went on my own this time, and I went looking for someone. I went looking for Disa. This is where she lived. This is Haukadal. I got there in September, and even though it was the end of autumn, it was still really warm. So I was able to go for a walk up into the valley on this really sunny day. And eventually got so hot that I took off my jumper, and then unbelievable in Iceland, and then I sat down in the grass, and I fell asleep in the grass. And when I woke up, I did feel that Disa was there as well, in the landscape and in the stories that this landscape holds onto and passes on to travelers. By the time Disa died, Iceland had become a Christian country. It was no longer bound by that ethic of revenge and total family honor. It was starting to pass. But people still have judged Disa for the choices that she made. People still felt that she did the wrong thing by betraying Geese Li. I think there's more to it than that. The Christians were the people who wrote her story up for us. And it's thanks to monks who put together those manuscripts that we have Disa's story today. This is a psalm that comes from that time, a psalm that was written by those Christians who wrote Disa's story for us. Heyr, himnasmiður, hver skaldið biður, komi mjúk til mín, miskunnin þín. Því heit ég á þig, þú hefur skaftan minn. Ég þrællinn þinn, þú drottinn minn. Thank you.